Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 6 of
Wonton Boys.
And today's episode, we are talking about Chineseness and what makes a product Chinese.
Yeah, what makes a product Chinese? I think at this point, we don't have to mention it, right? A lot of things are made in China, but
Right.
then what makes a product a Chinese product? Is there a definition to it? The example that I can think about is, do you think an iPhone is a Chinese product?
Yes. You know, it's funny. They used to always have a label on the iPhone when it first came out that it would be designed in California, but made in China. You know, and later on, there's no such text on the back of an iPhone because it's so ubiquitous and obvious. But I think somehow people still associate iPhones as, you know, an American product.
Yes, because that's really interesting, right? How can you tell a product is Chinese? What defines this product? I think that line is pretty blurred, as we kind of discussed before. The iPhone, right? Everybody associate that as an American product, right? A lot of American brands do have a lot of factories in China, and they produce almost everything in China. Another example that I can think of is like when I have McDonald's in China, like, am I having an American meal? Because what happened is that the McDonald brand actually got acquired by Chinese. The McDonald in China is 100% Chinese because they got acquired by Chinese companies. So even though you're having your like Big Mac, however, though, you know, like the production, all the ingredients, and often also like all the staff, right? Obviously, they're all Chinese. So then you're pretty much left with an American brand with everything Chinese. So I think that's a really obvious, I mean, that's a very interesting phenomenon because you also, on the other end of the spectrum, you also have something like the stuff that you get in Walmart. Because when you think about it, right, like Chinese products are usually associated with like a lesser quality, mass produced. So I think that's a really good point to discuss. Like how do you know?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It seems like what we're suggesting now with the iPhone and with McDonald's, that the sort of a nationality of a product is really based on the brand and the ownership. And so it's not necessarily so tied with either the production, the manufacturing, or even where it's served. It's really like the ownership of the brand becomes sort of the overriding factor. And we have to say, like, well, is that a good thing? Or is that sort of like a misconception, like a popular misconception that people have? And does where a product is made, does that really impact like the quality and the nationality of the thing that you're buying?
Mm-hmm.
And then how are people pricing things based on that? You know, Apple is a great example. And also I think about is Chinese native smartphone brands like Xiaomi and Oppo and OnePlus. And those are basically, if you think about it, those are also manufactured mostly in China, except
the same factories, exact same factories as Apple products.
Right, and but somehow those are now associated with being Chinese technology products just because the ownership is Chinese. But like, what's really so different?
Do you think it's because of the name? Because, well, obviously Xiaomi and Huawei, they are Chinese names, right? But then when you think about another very obvious Chinese product, DJI, right? Like, do you think that's Chinese? Because DJI just doesn't sound obviously Chinese. I think that happens to a lot of, I mean, a good example, I also look at these Chinese brands is the perspective of Japanese brands, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, like Toyota is obviously Japanese. Honda is obviously Japanese, but do you know like Subaru? Do you know that's Japanese?
Yeah. Why do you say that Subaru is not Japanese?
Because it doesn't look Japanese. Like the logo doesn't scream Japanese. The way how it's spelled, it doesn't look like it looks like a American invention. Like, I don't know, like it looks like Shamu from like, you know, Ocean World, right?
Right. It's interesting to say, like, you know, maybe when a non-Western brand first starts to market to a Western country, they have to somehow, it's better to hide it behind a friendly kind of English name, and it's almost like it's a marketing kind of way to say, hey, we're not hostile, we're not a foreign brand, we're just as sort of like friendly as you think it is, and we're like open to it. And I think what could be interesting to look at is, you know, does like a Subaru company, did they outperform a Toyota before people got familiar with Toyota? And would a name as harmless as both DJI and OnePlus, which have no kind of Chinese connotations, do those outperform Chinese sounding Chinese brands?
Because I think, like, I have not done research in this, but like from perception, it seems like they are actually outperforming the brands. But also another point is that I think brands like DJI and OnePlus, they're also focused on premium products. They don't have like a cheap product line compared to, and a good example is Xiaomi, right? Because actually Xiaomi produce wonderful like home appliances. Like they have like AC, they have like really, really nice accessories, like some of the nicest accessories I have seen. But then because they started off as like a very cheap brand, so people don't perceive them as valuable as a brand like Tesla. Because I think like a good example, a parallel is like Tesla on cars, because Tesla started selling sports cars. So now when they sell domestic vehicles, people perceive the brands that have more value. So same goes for Huawei and Xiaomi, right? I think that's actually a problem. I think a lot of this is also just like brand perception, unfortunately. Right. Because because the language they use in the brand, right? It seems that like people kind of associate that with the with like, you know, the ethics of the brands, and you know, and also other things. But I think those are actually not really tied at all. In fact, they're barely related.
It's, you know, it seems like it's always difficult for a somewhat perceived lower value, like a budget brand, to move up to a higher brand. It's much easier for a brand that has perceived higher value to become more mass market over time. But something that has bucked the trend, and maybe it just takes time, is like those Japanese examples that you mentioned, right? So like Honda and Toyota. Honda started selling like lawnmowers and like motorcycles in the US before they started making cars, and now they're like a major car company that's like acceptable, you know, one of the biggest car companies in the US. And they were able to, over time, kind of make it become friendly to Western and also American audiences. And I wonder if this is just tied to the amount of time it takes for a brand to become recognized and for people to become comfortable about it before nationality, like, kind of
kicks in first. Yeah. But then also another interesting phenomenon is that even with Honda and Toyota, what we're seeing, a good comparison was also, you know, how Honda has like has the premium line, and it's called Infinity, right? And Toyota is the Lexus. So it also looks like these premium models, right? They're using European languages, and that same goes for a lot of different other brands that I can think of, right? Like the premium models just use like a European language to sound more luxe. Obviously, this is nothing new because a lot of American brands also work the same way. For example, you know, the coffee company Nespresso, right? That's actually owned by Nestle. So a lot of American or like European companies, they also use like, you know, pretty like European languages to kind of appeal for like a more product, because for some reason like Europe was considered more higher class, and like, you know, American like after that, and then like, you know, like Asians are less. But then, so that's not necessarily the case, especially in this kind of social economical world. So, well, it's very obvious to me, Made in China has a range to it. Definitely does not deserve the bad rap, in my opinion.
Right.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's a stereotype in the works, right?
And I think we can't sort of ignore like the impact and role of history that has all of this. You know, in sort of very academic terms, we could say, well, it's still like the brand perception that we have today is still very tied to like, you know, colonialism and like decolonization, and that really wasn't too long ago when that was still colonies still existed in the world, and sort of like the Eurocentrism that we're taught still in academia and all over the world, and that being like perceived still as like the most luxurious culture, right? That we're all trying to emulate now. And I think we've touched on this earlier in our podcast too. I remember like a story I heard on another podcast that talked about Jimmy Lai and how he founded the fashion brand Giordano's. And Giordano's is a fashion brand, you know, just based in Hong Kong. But, you know, when he's tried to build this fashion retailer from some of the garment factories that he was working in, tried to own his own business, he picked the name Giordano on a trip to New York City. And like he found the word Giordano to be very like Italian and luxurious, so he just took that name and started in Hong Kong a brand that sounded Italian, and you know the brand did very well for a long time.
Yes. So to give our audience a context, Giordano is a Hong Kong brand that primarily sells to China. That's why you never see it overseas. That's why probably most of you don't know about this brand unless you're from Hong Kong or China. Yes, but Giordano is a very good example because and I think this ownership thing is really interesting because you have kind of the likes of the reverse happen in China, where a lot of Chinese brands, they assume European names, right, to kind of appeal for the for the domestic market. So you can also say that for KFCs and McDonald's, even on food. So these kind of ownership becomes really blurred, right? Like, what are you buying? Like, you're not even buying, like you're merely just buying an impression of the brand. It seems to me because okay, like you can have a brand that just like that is, you know, the claims is all from Europe, but then like it actually appears not to be from Europe. I mean, a very also on that spectrum, right? Another very interesting brand that I want to mention is Miniso. It's like the Daughter General of China, but it's called Miniso. The idea is really kind of like a Japanese name on their website. Like this is like a like a $10 billion company or something like that. It's really big. However, though, the owner claims that the design team is from Japan, and the head of the designer is called, I think the name is called something like what's it called? Junya Miyaki, I think the name. So apparently, I believe like the designer actually doesn't exist. Like the head designer, the design director doesn't exist, and the owner of the company just pieced together Junya Watanabe and like Issei Miyake. Both are really famous Japanese designers, fashion designers, onto their website as like, and then he hired a model to pose as like the fake Japanese designer so it can sell as a Japanese brand.
I remember Miniso from when I was in Shanghai, like when I visited Shanghai a while ago. Yeah, and they're everywhere. They're kind of like a budget version of like, you know, Muji or something. But you would never know. Yeah,
exactly. So you would never know where these brands come from. Like I think, but then also on the same note, I think actually a lot of Chinese brands, I think especially in the past 2 years, have been taking more ownership of the brands. For example, there are new like underwear brands that are actually using like Chinese names, so that they actually don't sound exotic anymore. So I think that is also starting to change in China, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in the US, one Chinese brand that's gotten a lot of interest and excitement lately is Anta, the old sports brand, because they're about to, I think, IPO in the US, and people are starting to learn more about this native, you know, multi-billion-dollar sports brand in China that's sort of, you know, trying to compete with Nike and Adidas and other things like that. So
yeah.
But
Yeah, but on the note of Anta, they are actually bigger than Nike, I believe, or as big as Nike, because funny enough, Anta has also acquired a bunch of foreign brands. So, for example, it might sound pretty crazy to you because like for example, like like Arc'teryx, the outdoors brand, that's owned by Anta.
Mm,
You know,
mm,
like their parent company was owned by Anta. So
I
Anta
see.
actually has a lot of European brands under their names too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um,
Hmm.
and that's almost sort of like how, after the last recession, Volvo came under the ownership of Geely, which is like this massive Chinese company, this massive Chinese car
Hmm.
company. So when you buy a Volvo, you don't think that you're buying a Chinese car, you're buying a Swedish car, but it's actually it's Chinese ownership and at the end of the day. And similar to that, ThinkPads are now owned by Lenovo, which is a Chinese brand after IBM
Hmm.
sold the division. So you never think, but a ThinkPad is Chinese now. So yeah, anyways.
Oh, really? I always thought ThinkPads are Chinese. They're not,
There you
right?
go. No, there
There
you
we go.
go.
Yeah,
There you
I
go.
used a ThinkPad before. I always thought they're Chinese. See, like these brand owner, like right, like where you perceive the brand come from doesn't necessarily reflect where it's actually from or where the revenue goes to. So this kind of idea of ownership and nationality with brands, I think it really needs to change, honestly. And for the better. And that is why we're making this show, just to let you guys know that this is a pretty complicated issue, and also don't take things for face value, because when you look a little bit underneath the surface with Google, um, you can see a lot clearer picture, I think, of how the network of brand goes. So a Chinese product that's not necessarily Chinese looking, or a Chinese brand that's necessarily, doesn't necessarily come in the form of like, very obvious Chinese marketing either.
Right, right. And I think we live in a global economy today, and everything is a little bit more interconnected and a little messier than you might first imagine them to be. And so our job when we look at these brands, I think brands are always an aspirational product. When people buy certain things from certain nationalities,
Yep.
they feel like they have a piece of that, and they are proud to carry those products. They're proud to wear the products, proud to display their products as a sign of who they are and that person and their personality. And sort of like, the ownership of those things aren't so questioned and critical for them, but it's something to always consider when you think about, if you feel, if there are any sort of prejudice feelings you have about one country, or you think some places are better than others. These are more the critical questions that we can always ask.
So
No,
yeah, so I think that pretty much sums it up. This is a super interesting topic, and this is
yeah,
definitely not going to be the only episode we're going to be talking about it. So in the future, if you're interested in this topic, please like and subscribe. And also, we will dive a lot deeper into what is a Chinese product, I think, in our future videos. Stay tuned,
yes,
and we will see you next episode.
yes, and stay tuned for our series Made in China. Thanks for listening. All right,
Okay,
see you next time.
bye.